You've said mindfulness practice, basic mindfulness practice a couple of times. We started with your personal experience with meditation. What is mindfulness at a broad level, and where does meditation kind of fit into that definition?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So I think, for example, John Kabat-Zinn has a definition of mindfulness where he talks about it being paying attention, on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And from a pragmatic standpoint, I think of it as, having two elements, awareness. We're aware of what's happening, but we're also bringing this attitude of curiosity in. So we're not seeing it through our cognitive bias lenses where, it's like the rosy colored or the dark colored or the whatever bias glasses that we, often live our worlds in, and walking around seeing the world through those glasses where we're distorting reality. So it's about taking those glasses off. And one way to help take those off is just to really be curious. And instead of assuming or judging what's happening, we're just really taking it in. So this attitude of curiosity that comes with awareness. And if we think of how that relates to meditation, we can be aware and curious when we're meditating or not meditating. So I think of meditation as a small circle within this larger circle. If you think of a Venn diagram, meditation can be a practice where we're paying attention, we're being curious, we're aware of what's happening. And we don't have to be meditating to be mindful. We don't have to be meditating to be aware and curious. And so, it's kind of a way to do a formal kind of think of it as a mental workout. We can be exercising by walking down the street. We can also go to the gym for a specific period of time and do specific exercises. And I think the mental gym functions the same way. We can sit down and meditate. We can do some walking meditation. We can do formal practices that support that awareness.
And does that formal dedicated practice where you're carving out time to train the mind as you would go to the gym and train the physical body, does that translate over to how the brain is functioning and awareness outside of that formal practice?
I would say yes, and it's even hard to differentiate them. So, when I started meditating, it was really, I was doing these formal practices. I was sitting meditation, doing walking meditation and things like that. Yet when we, in our first randomized controlled trial of smoking cessation, we looked to see what practices were helping people quit smoking. So we looked both at the formal practices, like formal meditation practices, and we also looked at the informal practices where people were learning to be with their cravings in the moment that they were smoking. So, or in the moment that they were having an urge to smoke. So somebody's driving their car and they've got an urge to smoke. They're not pulling over on the side of the road and pulling out their meditation cushion and meditating. They're working with that urge in real time. And what we found was that these informal practices mediate or moderated the outcomes, the smoking cessation, even more than the formal practices. So certainly formal practices can be helpful. We were finding that informal practices in certain circumstances are even more helpful. And the way I think of that is both are helpful, but neither are helpful if you don't practice them. So that's actually informed how we've developed programs for helping people learn these techniques. And we actually start with the informal and incorporate them into somebody's everyday life. And then we layer in the formal practice and say, hey, if you'd like to do more, if you'd like to do something formally, you can do that as well. I guess it's kind of like having somebody who's been sedentary for a long time go for a walk and say, hey, how's it feel to be moving? And they're like, oh, that feels pretty good. And I say, well, you can keep walking. And if you'd like to go to the gym, that can help as well.
Okay. So there's layers to mindfulness. It's not just that image that we might have in our mind of that person out in nature kind of meditating. It's more than that. We might put a pin in that and come back to that as we kind of progress through this conversation.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
You mentioned there the study that you looked at, or studies looking at smoking cessation. So your research has been interested, or you've been interested in both how mindfulness affects the actual brain, what's happening in terms of brain physiology, and then also how these practices can affect kind of hard outcomes in terms of habit change.
Yeah, we got interested, this is a long time ago now, just in starting with the basic questions because they hadn't been answered yet. And one of the basic questions, the first ones that we started asking was, hey, what's going on in the brain when somebody is meditating? And so we looked at experienced and novice meditators, and we also wanted to look at commonalities between different meditation practices because there are a gazillion different types of practices. You can imagine many, many ways to train that awareness, many, many ways to train that curiosity. So we weren't looking for, here is this one meditation that is, better than all the others. We wanted to see what was common. So we brought very experienced meditators and then novice meditators into our lab. I was at Yale University at the time. And we, scanned their brains while they were meditating using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And at first, we had this hypothesis that, there's got to be some brain region or network that's activated when people are meditating, because it certainly felt like I was doing something when I was meditating. And ready for this? We didn't find a single brain region that was increased in activity in experienced versus novice meditators. And so at first, we were thinking, oh man, what's going on? Is this a failed experiment or whatnot? But then I started thinking, and I just said, well, let's look at the opposite. Let's flip the script and see if there are deactivations in experienced meditators versus novices. And here we found something that was not only fascinating, but it kind of shifted how we thought about practice, which was there's this network of brain regions called the default mode network, which is aptly named because it's what we default to when we're not doing anything in particular. And that network has been shown now to be activated during self-referential processing. So I think of it as the self network. So when we're thinking about ourselves in the past or the future, when we're craving all sorts of stuff, anything from chocolate to cigarettes to cocaine to gambling to all this, this activates the default mode network. And also with psychological conditions. So for example, if somebody is ruminating, which is a hallmark of depression, they're activating the default mode network. When they're worrying, which is a hallmark of anxiety, they're activating this default mode network. Experienced meditators, deactivating that network relative to novices when they were meditating. And so that started to paint a picture around, instead of doing something, we have to think of, I get all these questions all the time. It's like, well, how do I clear my mind? Because people have these conceptions of meditation as a way to kind of clear their mind, blank out, zone out, bliss out, zen out, whatever out. Well, that sounds in the Western mind active, like I'm doing something to zen out. When we look at the data, what the data suggests are that we're actually being with our experience and not getting caught up in it. And so when we get caught up in thinking about ourselves, that's when this default mode network gets particularly activated. And these practices help train us to notice that tendency to get caught up in self-referential thinking and notice the tendencies to get caught up in craving and just observe those as thoughts, as sensations, as emotions, and not get caught up in them. So I think of it as learning to be with our experience instead of doing something to change our experience. And when we can learn to be with our experience, we don't have to do anything because the experience is going to change on its own. And if there's a craving, we can be with that craving. It's going to come and go. We don't have to do anything. And so there's this active awareness, but I think of it as this non-forced being with our experience that is actually much more powerful than doing something about it.
If we're not aware, then the default mode network is kind of running on autopilot, and there can be various responses or actions that we're taking that are not in our best interest that we're unaware of.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So the purpose of mindfulness being to kind of shine a light on these things that are occurring on sort of autopilot, as you put it.
Yeah, you can think of it as, instead of habitually reacting, which is what we tend to do when we're on autopilot, it's just whatever our habit mode is going to play out, and we're passively kind of getting caught up in it. Instead of habitually reacting, we are responding with awareness. So when there's awareness, it gives us this space where we can have choice, and we can start to see, is that actually helpful? Is that not helpful as compared to, there's that itch, scratch it.